The sky over Wyoming was the first thing a person noticed. It wasn't just a ceiling, it was a presence. On days like this, it was a dome of unblemished, almost aggressive cobalt blue stretched so vast and empty from one horizon to the other that it seemed to press down on the land with a physical weight. Underneath this immense dome, the world was a palette of muted, hardy colors. The silver green of endless sagebrush, the pale gold of cured grasses, and the distant purple-gray slashes of the Teton Range, which stood like ancient, sleeping sentinels against the edge of the world. The wind, a constant and restless inhabitant, was the land's only voice, whispering through the wire of fences and carrying the dusty, clean perfume of the high plains. Upon a low rolling hill that gave him a commanding view of this kingdom of solitude, William Will Blackwood sat astride his horse. The man was an extension of the landscape itself, tall, solid, and shaped by the unforgiving seasons. The shoulders of his canvas coat were broad enough to carry burdens, and his hands, calloused from a lifetime of work, rested with familiar ease on the worn leather of his saddle horn. At 40, the hair at his temples was silvered by a grief more profound than his years should have allowed. His gaze, sharp and discerning, swept across the valley floor, where 1,000 head of Blackwood cattle moved like a single slow brown river, a testament to a decade of relentless ambition. He owned everything his eye could see, a sprawling empire carved from the stubborn Wyoming soil. He had power, the kind that made men in Cheyenne listen when he spoke, and wealth that could buy him anything he desired. Yet, as his eyes tracked the movements of his herd, there was no pride in his gaze, no warmth of ownership. There was only a hollow, aching void. His success was a fortress he had built brick by brick, but he had built it around an empty chamber. He was a king ruling over a land of echoes. His horse shifted beneath him, and the creak of leather was a sharp sound in the vast silence. He turned the animal and began the slow ride back toward the ranch house. From a distance, it was an impressive sight, a 2-story structure of dark, solid pine with a wide porch and glass windows that caught the afternoon sun. It was a house built to be filled with the noise and warmth of a family. Now it was little more than a beautifully crafted mausoleum. Inside, the silence was a physical presence. Sunlight streamed through the clean windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, but it brought no cheer. The floors, polished by a quiet housekeeper who came and went like a ghost, did not creak with the footfalls of a wife or the running of a child. Will walked through the rooms, his boots loud on the hardwood, a stranger in his own home. He would eat a solitary meal in a dining room with a table set for 8. He would sit by a grand stone hearth where the fire burned only for him. Every object, a rocking chair his wife Sarah had loved, a small, hand-carved horse on the mantelpiece that belonged to his son Daniel, was a monument to a life that had been stolen from him by a single brutal blizzard 7 years ago. He had survived, but his heart had been frozen solid, and no Wyoming summer had been warm enough to thaw it. Miles to the east, where the lush grasslands of the Blackwood Ranch gave way to stonier, less forgiving soil, Emma Rose was engaged in her own solitary war. Her enemy was a single, defiant fence post. The wood, weathered to a skeletal gray, was rotten at its base. Each time she heaved it upright, packing dirt and rocks around it with her bare hands, it would hold for a teasing moment before leaning again with a weary, splintering groan. Sweat traced clean paths through the grime on her face, and the muscles in her back and shoulders burned with an acidic fire. Her small homestead was a study in decay. It was the physical embodiment of a dream dying a slow death. The barn roof, patched with rusted scraps of tin, sagged in the middle. The fields her husband Thomas had once plowed with such boundless optimism were now a tangle of thistle and stubborn weeds. Thomas had been a man who saw potential everywhere in the rocky soil, in the distant gleam of the mountains, and the promise of a future built with his own two hands. He had been strong and full of laughter, and now he was a memory buried under a simple wooden cross on the hill behind the house, a victim of a mind collapse that had crushed his body and her world. She straightened up, pressing a hand to the small of her back, and glared at the defiant post. "Oh, Thomas," she murmured, a habit she'd formed to combat the crushing loneliness. "You always said this land had good bones. You forgot to mention its spirit is meaner than a cornered badger." Her neighbors, who had offered condolences and casseroles in the first weeks of her widowhood, now averted their eyes when she rode into town. Poverty, she had learned, was a contagion they feared. She was on her own, a fine-boned woman fighting a heavyweight battle against debt decay and the sheer grinding force of nature. Silas Croft, the man who held the note on her land, was circling like a vulture, his polite letters becoming less polite with each passing month. As the sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks of the Tetons, casting the plains in a long golden light, Emma finally gave up on the fence for the day. She leaned against a sturdy section, her chest heaving, and watched the sky bleed into shades of orange and rose. At that same moment, miles away, Will Blackwood stood on his porch watching the same sunset. They were two solitary souls under the same immense, beautiful, and unforgiving sky, each trapped in their own wilderness of loss, unaware that the Wyoming wind, which carried the scent of dust and distant rain, was about to weave their separate threads into a single tangled fate. Chak Chan Roy, Jai La Chuang Do Qua Shao Chuyen Juok Viet Chi Tiet J Tiep Noi Chuang Truok. Chapter 2. Echoes and Embers. For Will Blackwood. The past was not another country. It was a room in his own house, a cold space he was forced to walk through every night. The trigger was often the fire. He would sit in his large leather armchair staring into the hearth where orange and yellow flames wrestled with seasoned pine logs. The fire was controlled, contained a source of manageable warmth, and it was this very control that summoned the memory of its opposite, a wild, untamable cold that had devoured his world. The blizzard of '88 had arrived without subtlety. It was a physical wall of white that slammed into the valley, erasing the world. The wind did not howl. It shrieked a high, thin sound of utter fury. Will had been caught in it while searching for stray cattle on the northern range, less than a mile from his own front door. For 2 days he fought his way through a landscape rendered alien, a churning chaos of snow and ice where all landmarks had vanished. He survived on raw grit and the instinct that drove him toward the two souls who were his compass. When he finally, half-frozen and delirious, broke through the snowdrift that had buried his front porch, a terrible silence greeted him. It was a silence more profound than quiet, a stillness that was an absence of life. The fire in the hearth was dead. A fine layer of snow had been driven through the window frames, dusting the furniture like a funeral shroud. He found them in the bedroom, huddled together. Sarah, his vibrant, laughing Sarah, had her arm wrapped tightly around their son, Daniel. They were covered in every blanket and quilt the house possessed. But the cold had been a patient thief. It had crept through the walls, stolen the warmth from the fire, and then, piece by piece, stolen the breath from their lungs. They looked like they were sleeping a stillness so absolute he knew it could never be broken. The sound that tore from his own throat was not a scream, but the hollow, ragged roar of a soul being ripped in two. Even now, 7 years later, sitting before a roaring fire, that memory could touch him with its phantom chill, a cold that no flame could ever truly warm. For Emma Rose, the past was not a ghost. It was a debt collector. It arrived in the form of crisp white envelopes bearing the elegant, flowing script of Silas Croft. The letters were always polite, filled with feigned condolences for her loss. Before getting to the point, the loan Thomas had taken out for seed and equipment was past due. The civilized tone of the letters only made the threat they contained more menacing. Croft was a patient predator, and she knew he was simply waiting for the right moment to close in for the kill. The last of her savings was gone. The garden was failing. There was only one thing left to do. The decision to ride into Jackson Hole was a quiet defeat, an admission that she could no longer fight her battle alone on the homestead. She gathered the few things of value she had left. There were Thomas's carpentry tools, their steel heads oiled and their hickory handles worn smooth by his hands. Each one felt like a piece of his ambition. And there was a small heart-shaped silver locket, a gift from her mother on her 16th birthday. Placing these items in a wooden crate felt like packing away pieces of her own history for sale. Jackson Hole was a churn of activity. Freight wagons rumbled down the main street, their drivers shouting curses at stubborn mules. Men in dusty hats gathered outside the saloon, their laughter coarse and loud. The air smelled of horse manure, hot metal from the blacksmith's forge, and frying bacon. Emma found a small space near the mercantile, laid a threadbare blanket over a crate, and arranged her meager wares. The town's indifference was a heavy cloak. People glanced her way, their eyes registering a familiar story. Another homesteader down on her luck, another widow's sorrow on display. A blacksmith picked up one of Thomas's chisels, admiring its balance before shaking his head and moving on. A well-dressed woman looked at the locket, her lips pursed, and offered a price that was a plain insult. Hour after hour, Emma sat with a straight back and a calm face, a mask of composure hiding the frantic desperation that was clawing at her insides. Will saw her from across the street. He was in town for sacks of grain and a new axe head, a routine trip. But the sight of her stopped him. He recognized her as the woman from the struggling homestead on his eastern border. He saw the proud, unbroken line of her spine. He saw the way she met the pitying glances of strangers with a quiet defiance that seemed to broadcast that she was bent but not broken. There was a strength in her that reminded him so fiercely of Sarah that it was a physical blow knocking the air from his lungs. His first instinct was to mount his horse and ride on to retreat to the safety of his numb solitude. To engage even in the smallest way was to risk feeling. But he couldn't shake the image of her. It was the locket that did it. He saw her trace its shape with her finger, her expression momentarily vulnerable, and the ice around his heart cracked just enough for a painful empathy to seep through. He waited, his decision made in an instant. A large freight wagon, laden with timber, rumbled past, momentarily blocking the view of Emma's small display. It was the distraction he needed. In a few swift, silent strides, he crossed the street. His movements were precise, economical. He passed the back of her wagon. His face turned away, and with a motion so quick it was almost invisible, he placed the small, heavy leather pouch on the seat. He did not pause. He did not look back. He continued on to the mercantile, his heart pounding with a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. Long after he had gone, as the sun began to cast long shadows down the street, Emma finally accepted defeat. Her memories were not for sale. With a heavy heart, she began to pack Thomas's tools back into the crate. As she turned to put the blanket in the wagon, her hand brushed against the unexpected weight of the pouch. Frowning, she picked it up. It was made of soft, unmarked leather. When she loosened the drawstring, her breath caught in her throat. inside, nestled in the gloom, was the unmistakable gleam of gold coins. It was an impossible sum, a fortune, a miracle. She looked up, her eyes wide with bewilderment, scanning the street, the faces of the strangers passing by. But there was no one, nothing. The gift was as mysterious as the wind, a silent act of grace that had just bought her a fighting chance. The stranger's gold was a miracle that manifested in the most practical of ways. It became a sack of flour sitting heavy and reassuring on the floor of Emma's pantry. It transformed into a small bag of precious seeds for a late-season garden, a box of nails, and enough lamp oil to keep the darkness at bay for months. The money was a buffer against the immediate gnawing hunger of poverty, a small dam holding back the flood of desperation. It did not solve her problems. The land was still stubborn, the roof still leaked, and Silas Croft's shadow still loomed, but it gave her breathing room. And, more than that, it gave her a secret to hold on to. In her loneliest moments, she would think of the ghost of Jackson Hole, her anonymous benefactor, and feel a flicker of warmth. The knowledge that a stranger had seen her and chosen kindness over indifference was a shield for her spirit. But gold could not tame the wild Wyoming land. It could not by itself raise a fence against the wind and the wandering cattle that threatened her small pasture. The physical work remained a daily testament to her solitary struggle. It was this struggle that drew Will Blackwood's eye. He began to patrol the eastern boundary of his ranch with a frequency that his foreman found peculiar. He told himself it was about checking his own fences, about keeping an eye on his herds. But he knew it was a lie. He was an unwilling spectator drawn to the small embattled homestead as if by a magnetic force. From the vantage point of a low ridge, he would watch her. He saw her as a small solitary figure moving with dogged determination against the vast canvas of the plains. He watched her haul water from the creek, her shoulders straining. He watched her coax life from her small garden, her hands covered in dirt. He saw her tenacity, her absolute refusal to surrender, and it stirred a feeling he had long since buried admiration. One afternoon, the wind carried the sharp, distinct sound of her frustration up to his ridge, a cry of anger as a fence rail she was trying to lift slipped from her grasp and clattered to the ground. He watched her kick the offending piece of wood, a small, very human act of defiance. And in that moment, the wall he had so carefully constructed around his heart fractured. He could not just sit and watch anymore. He nudged his horse forward, descending from the ridge in a slow, deliberate line. Emma did not notice him at first, her attention consumed by the recalcitrant fence. The sound of his horse's hooves on the dry, gravelly soil was what finally made her look up. She straightened instantly, her body going rigid. She saw the tall, imposing figure of her reclusive neighbor, Mr. Blackwood, approaching. Her first instinct was not gratitude, but suspicion. A woman alone learned quickly that unexpected visits, especially from powerful men, rarely ended well. Her hand tightened on the handle of her hammer. Will reined in a few yards away, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat brim. He didn't offer a polite greeting. He simply assessed the broken fence with a critical eye. "That post needs a stronger arm," he said. His voice was a low baritone, rough with disuse, but carrying no judgment. It was a simple statement of fact. Emma's defensive posture eased slightly. He wasn't mocking her. He was diagnosing the problem. "I suppose it does." She conceded, her own voice tight. Without another word, Will dismounted. He moved with a quiet, powerful grace, taking the heavy mallet from her without asking. He positioned the leaning post, his boots planted firmly, and with 3 precise explosive blows drove it deep into the resistant earth. The ground shuddered. The post stood arrow straight as if it had never dared to lean. Emma stared, momentarily stunned by the sheer effortless application of strength. What followed was a silent ballet of labor. Will moved down the fence line, testing each post, his movements economical and certain. He didn't offer instructions, but Emma found herself falling into a natural rhythm with him. When he tore out a rotten post, she was there to clear the old wood. When he set a new one, she had the rails ready. He would drive the posts with the heavy mallet. She, with her smaller hammer, would follow behind her nimble movements, securing the rails with quick, sharp taps of the nails. They didn't speak. The air was filled only with the sounds of their work, the solid thud of the mallet, the sharp tack-tack-tack of her hammer, the scrape of wood, and the shared rhythm of their breathing under the hot sun. In this shared silence, they learned more about each other than words could have conveyed. She saw in him not just strength, but a deep ingrained competence, a familiarity with the world of wood and wire. He saw in her not weakness, but an unyielding spirit and a surprising deftness. He respected her effort. She respected his skill. Around midday, he paused, uncorking his canteen. He drank deeply before extending it to her. She hesitated for only a second before accepting the cool water, a blessing on her throat. In return, she retrieved a small bundle from the base of a tree and offered him half of her meager lunch, a piece of cornbread. He took it with a solemn nod and ate it, the simple act feeling like a formal treaty being signed between two sovereign nations. They finished as the sun began to slant toward the west. 100 yards of broken leaning fence was now a straight, sturdy line, a tangible monument to their shared afternoon. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." Emma said, her voice sincere and quiet. The wariness had gone, replaced by a deep, weary gratitude. "I am in your debt." He shook his head, his gaze finally meeting hers directly. For a moment, she saw past the stoic rancher to the lonely man beneath. "A good fence is its own reward, Mrs. Rose," he said, his voice softer than before. "Keeps what's important in and what's not out." He mounted his horse, and with a final brief nod rode back toward his own vast lands. Emma remained by the fence, her hand resting on the smooth, solid wood of a new post. She watched him go, a tall figure shrinking against the horizon. A strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with the sun. It wasn't just her fence that felt stronger. A fracture in her solitude had been mended, and for the first time the vast Wyoming landscape felt a little less lonely. The days that followed settled into a new and fragile rhythm. Will's visits to the eastern edge of his property became a near-daily occurrence. The pretense of checking his fences wore thin, replaced by a comfortable, unspoken understanding. He never announced his coming, but would simply appear, a tall figure on horseback, as if summoned by some need she hadn't yet voiced. One day he would arrive with a freshly dressed deer slung over his saddle, offering it with a gruff comment about his larder being too full. Another, he would spend an hour silently and efficiently fixing the stubborn pump on her well that had plagued her for weeks. In return, Emma began to watch for him. She would have a pot of strong hot coffee ready, and they would sit on her small porch, often in a silence that was more companionable than any conversation she had ever known. She learned the language of his quietness. The slight tightening of his jaw meant he was troubled. A slow, deliberate nod was the highest form of approval. He, in turn, learned to read the subtle shifts in her expression. The weariness that sometimes shadowed her resilient eyes, the small, rare smile that transformed her face when one of her newly planted seeds finally sprouted. It was a fragile bloom of companionship in a harsh and lonely land, and both of them in their own cautious ways began to nurture it. This delicate peace was destined to be broken. Its end arrived in the form of 3 riders who cast long, predatory shadows in the late morning sun. Emma recognized them immediately. The 2 men in the rear were rough-looking hands she had seen in Croft's employ. The man in the lead, however, was Silas Croft himself. He was dressed as always for town, not for the trail. His black coat was free of dust, and his boots were polished to a high sheen, an insult to the dusty ground they stood upon. He dismounted with an air of smug ownership, his smile a thin, bloodless line on his face. "Good morning, Mrs. Rose," he said, his voice as smooth and cold as a river stone. His eyes, small and intelligent, flickered over the repaired fence, the weeded garden patch, and the generally improved state of the homestead. They settled on her with a look of frank disapproval. "I see you have been industrious." "Mr. Croft," Emma said, her voice steady. She stood on her porch, refusing to give ground. Behind her, she could hear the quiet click of the rifle Will had insisted on leaving with her. "I also see you have found a benefactor." Croft continued, his gaze drifting pointedly toward the distant Blackwood Ranch. "Mr. Blackwood's charity is well known, though usually not so personally administered." The insinuation was a drop of poison intended to shame her and redefine Will's kindness as the pity of a rich man for a pathetic creature. Will chose that moment to emerge from the small stand of cottonwoods near the creek where he had been helping her clear a new irrigation ditch. He moved without haste, his presence alone a solid and irrefutable answer to Croft's venom. He stopped beside the porch, his height and sheer physical presence making Croft's men shift nervously in their saddles. "Croft," Will said. It was not a greeting, but a statement of fact, cold and hard. Croft's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Blackwood. I was just admiring Mrs. Rose's resilience. It is almost a shame my foreclosure proceedings will render it all moot." He had dropped the pretense. This was a declaration of war. The first attack came 3 days later. Emma was leading her small herd of 12 cattle, her entire net worth on 4 legs, to the creek when 2 riders burst from a hidden ravine. They were Croft's men. Whooping and firing their pistols into the air, they charged directly at the small herd. The air filled with the thunder of hooves and the panicked, wide-eyed terror of the animals. It was over in minutes. Her herd, the product of years of careful breeding by Thomas, was scattered to the 4 winds, a frantic, desperate stampede into the wilderness. It took her and Will 2 grueling days to track down 8 of them. 4 were lost for good. The second attack was far more personal. Will had assigned one of his most trusted men, a quiet, steady hand named Jed, to stay at Emma's homestead to stand guard through the night. It was a gesture of protection that Croft clearly saw as a challenge. One moonless night, Emma was jolted awake not by a sound, but by an unnatural flickering orange light against her window. A thick, acrid smell filled the air. Smoke. She and Jed burst out of the house to a scene from hell. The barn, her barn, where she stored her winter hay, Thomas's tools, and her hopes for survival, was engulfed in a roaring conflagration. The flames, hungry and alive, leaped toward the night sky, consuming the dry wood with a terrifying roar. The heat was a physical blow. There was nothing they could do but watch it burn. Watch a piece of her past and her future turn to ash. By the time Will arrived, riding like a fury in response to the hellish glow on the horizon, the barn was a collapsing skeleton of blackened timbers against the dawn. He stood beside her amidst the smoking ruins, his face a mask of granite. His silence was more terrible than any curse. The final, most brilliant stroke of Croft's cruelty arrived at noon in the form of the county sheriff. He was a portly man with a nervous twitch, and he could not meet Emma's eye as he handed her the official-looking paper. It was a warrant for her arrest. "What is this?" Will's voice was a low growl. The sheriff swallowed hard, beads of sweat on his brow. "A formal complaint, Will, filed by Mr. Croft." He cleared his throat and read from the document in a shaky voice. "For the crime of cattle rustling 10 head from his property, and for the willful destruction of personal property, this barn specifically, in an attempt to destroy evidence of said crime." The world tilted under Emma's feet. The paper trembled in her hand. It was a lie so audacious, so complete in its wickedness that it stole the very air from her lungs. She was the victim, her life systematically destroyed, and now she was being named the criminal. She looked from the smoking ruins of her hopes to the legal document in her hand, then to the cold, resolute fury in Will Blackwood's eyes. Croft hadn't just burned down her barn. He had set fire to the entire world and was now trying to frame her for holding the match. Chak Chan Roy. Jai La Chuang Phaf Kua Kiao Chuyen. Chapter 5. A Covenant of Convenience. After the sheriff departed, leaving the warrant on the crude wooden table, a dead, suffocating stillness fell upon Emma's small kitchen. The document lay there like a coiled snake, its official script a venomous poison that had paralyzed her will. She sat numbly, her hands limp in her lap, staring at a crack in the floorboards. The world had ceased to make sense. The concepts of justice and truth felt like childish fantasies. There was only the brutal reality of power, and Silas Croft held all of it. The fire in her, the defiant spirit that had kept her fighting for so long, had been extinguished, leaving behind only the cold ash of despair. Will did not sit. He stood by the single window, his back to her, looking out at the distant, unmoving line of the Teton Range. He was utterly still, but it was the stillness of a boulder before an avalanche, a dangerous energy held in perfect, terrible equilibrium. The air around him seemed to crackle with a cold, contained fury. He wasn't just angry. He was calculating. His mind, honed by years of surviving in a land that offered no second chances, was working like a cold engine of war, assessing the trap they were in, searching for a weakness, an angle, any move at all. He's thought of everything. Emma's voice was a deadened whisper, devoid of emotion. The sheriff is his man. The cattle are gone. The barn is gone. My word against his. It's over. He has the law on his side, Will corrected her, his voice a low, hard rumble. He still had not turned around. That's not the same as having the truth. He fell silent for a long moment, the only sound the faint hiss of the wind outside. When he finally turned to face her, his eyes were like chips of dark granite, and his face was set in a mask of grim resolve. He had found his move. It was desperate. It was insane. And it was the only one they had left. "Marry me," he said. The words dropped into the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Emma's head snapped up, her numb shock pierced by sheer unadulterated disbelief. She stared at him, certain she had gone mad, or he had. A hysterical laugh bubbled in her throat, but it died before it could make a sound. He held up a hand, forestalling the torrent of questions and protests he saw gathering in her eyes. "This is not a proposal of the heart, Emma. Do you understand? It is a business proposition, a legal strategy." He walked to the table and stood over her, his presence looming, his voice low, urgent, and stripped of all sentiment. He laid out the logic as a master strategist would lay out a battle plan. "Listen to me. As Emma Rose, a widow, struggling with debt, you are the perfect victim. Croft's lawyers will paint you as a desperate thief and a liar, and a jury of men will believe it. You are vulnerable, and he is exploiting that vulnerability." He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table, forcing her to meet his intense gaze. "But, as Mrs. William Blackwood, everything changes. You're no longer an isolated homesteader. You become an extension of my holdings. Your land becomes my land. Your cattle become my cattle. Your name becomes my name. An accusation of theft against you becomes a direct accusation against the Blackwood Cattle Company. Silas Croft is a bully who enjoys tormenting the weak. I promise you, he has no stomach for a fight with me." He was offering her a shield. Not just any shield, but the most powerful one in the valley his name. He was offering her a legal fortress. He called it a covenant of convenience, the words formal and cold, stripping the act of any pretense of romance. It was a contract, a merger of two desperate parties for the purpose of mutual survival. Emma's mind was a whirlwind. To marry this man, this quiet, haunted stranger who was only just beginning to feel like a friend, to tie herself to him to surrender her name, Thomas's name, and her independence. It felt like an impossible, unthinkable choice. But then she looked at the alternative. She saw a courtroom filled with hostile faces. She saw the iron bars of a prison cell. She saw Silas Croft smiling his thin, cold smile as he stood on the porch of her home, now his. The choice was not between freedom and marriage. It was between a terrible, certain ruin and a dangerous, uncertain hope. She looked up at Will's unyielding face. He was not offering her comfort or love. He was offering her a weapon, and it was the only one that could save her. Her voice, when she found it, was a raw whisper. "All right, Mr. Blackwood." The use of his formal name, even as she agreed to become his wife, sealed the nature of their pact. "I will." The journey to Cheyenne was a long, silent affair. They rode side by side, two strangers united by a common enemy and a bizarre, desperate plan. The magnificent landscape passed by unnoticed. In the territorial capital, they found a circuit judge in a cramped, dusty office that smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. The judge was a man weary with the endless procession of human folly. He looked at the powerful rancher and the pale, determined woman before him, asked the requisite questions in a monotone, and showed no flicker of curiosity. The words of the ceremony were dry and legalistic, stripped of all beauty. "Do you, William Blackwood, take this woman? Do you, Emma Rose, take this man?" The most significant sound was the scratch of Will's pen on the marriage certificate, a signature that was firm and unwavering. Emma's followed her hand, trembling only slightly. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you man and wife," the judge declared, already reaching for his ledger to make the official entry. It was done. They walked out into the harsh sunlight, legally bound. The ride back began in that same heavy silence, but it was different now. It was charged with a new profound awkwardness. Before they were allies. Now they were husband and wife. She glanced at his strong profile, the profile of the man who was now her husband, and a wave of trepidation washed over her. They had forged their shield. But, in doing so, they had chained themselves together, and neither had any idea what this strange and dangerous covenant would truly cost them. The Cheyenne courthouse was an imposing structure of stone and dark wood designed to make a man feel small and answerable to a higher power. On this day, it succeeded. The air inside was stifling thick with the unwashed scent of nervous bodies and the gravitas of the law. Every seat was taken. This was more than a trial. It was a spectacle, a battle between the valley's most powerful rancher and its most ruthless landowner, with a lone woman's fate hanging in the balance. Silas Croft sat at the prosecution table looking immaculate and utterly confident. He conferred with his lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man from Cheyenne named Fletcher, a smug curl on his lip. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, and he viewed this proceeding as a mere formality before his inevitable victory. Across the room, Emma sat beside Will. A nervous tremor ran through her, but she fought it down, forcing her spine to remain straight. The simple, solid presence of Will next to her was an anchor. He was a statue of granite, his face an unreadable mask, his gaze fixed on the judge's bench. He had shed his rancher's clothes for a severe black suit that only emphasized his formidable presence. He looked less like a defendant's husband and more like a patient executioner. Fletcher opened the case with a masterful performance. He painted a vivid, convincing picture for the jury Emma Rose, a widow on the brink of financial ruin, her character weakened by desperation. He spoke of her sudden and suspicious good fortune after a trip to town hinting at dark deeds. He spoke of her unnatural association with Blackwood. His voice dripped with sympathy as he described his client, Mr. Croft, as a patient, generous man who had been repaid for his kindness with theft and deceit. Then he called his star witness, Daniel Brady, one of the two men who had testified to the sheriff, took the stand. He was clean-shaven and looked directly at the jury as he lied. With practiced ease, he recounted a fictitious story of seeing Emma and Will's man Jed driving cattle bearing Croft's brand under the cover of darkness. He described the brands, the time, the location. It was a seamless, damning narrative. Emma could feel the net tightening, could feel the jury's initial sympathy curdling into suspicion. When it was the defense's turn, Will's lawyer, an older, more deliberate man named Samuel Thompson, rose to his feet. He began his cross-examination of Brady gently. He didn't challenge the story itself. Instead, he asked about the weather, the time, small details. Then, his voice still quiet, he shifted his line of attack. "Mr. Brady," he said calmly, "you run a small ranch yourself, do you not? A quarter section up near Willow Creek?" Brady, who had been confident, now hesitated. "I do. A fine piece of land. But ranching is a hard business, is it not? It is difficult to make ends meet." Thompson paused. "Tell me, Mr. Brady, is it not true that Silas Croft holds the mortgage on your family's property?" The question landed like a physical blow. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Brady's face went pale, a sheen of sweat instantly appearing on his brow. He looked frantically toward Croft, who gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. I don't see what that has to do with anything," Brady stammered. "Oh, I believe it has everything to do with it." Thompson pressed his voice, hardening. "Is it not also true that your loan was in arrears, and that Mr. Croft threatened you and your family with eviction if you did not testify here today? If you did not tell the story he instructed you to tell?" The man on the stand visibly crumbled. His false confidence shattered, leaving only a terrified, trapped man. He looked at his shaking hands, then at the stern face of the judge, then back at the relentless gaze of the lawyer. The lie was too heavy to hold. Yes, Brady whispered, his voice cracking. "He said he'd ruin me. It was all a lie. We never saw a thing. He told us what to say." The courtroom erupted into furious murmurs. Croft was on his feet, his face purple with rage, shouting, "Objection! This is an outrage." The judge hammered his gavel, calling for order, his face a thunderous mask. Amidst the chaos, Thompson held up a document. "Your Honor, This may clarify matters. This is a sworn affidavit from a Mr. James Peterson, Mr. Brady's partner in this deception. Mr. Peterson, it seems, had a crisis of conscience and a fear of Mr. Croft that outweighed his fear of the law. He has fled the territory, but not before detailing the entire conspiracy in this statement, including Mr. Croft's direct orders to stampede Mrs. Rose's cattle, and I quote, "burn her out to teach the woman a lesson." The last pillar of Croft's case had turned to dust. The room was in an uproar, and then a new voice cut through the noise. Emma stood up. She had not planned it. The words simply rose in her demanding to be spoken. A sudden, profound silence fell over the room as every eye turned to her. Her voice, though not loud, was perfectly clear and steady, imbued with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Your Honor." She began, her gaze moving from the judge to the faces of the jury. "This trial was never about 10 head of cattle. It was about whether a person's life, their work, their home, can be stolen by a man with a long ledger and a cold heart." She held up her own hands, showing the calluses and the faint scars from her work. "This is what a homestead is. It's not just dirt and wood. It's a future you build with your own hands. It is the hope you plant in the ground with your seeds. Mr. Croft believes that his money gives him the power to crush that hope, to turn a person's sweat and tears into just another number in his account book." She looked directly at the jury, at the faces of farmers, ranchers, and merchants, people who understood the language of hard work. "Look at your own hands. Remember what it took to build what you have. That is real power. That is real worth. Do not let men like him, men who build their empires on the ruins of other people's dreams, convince you that it is worthless." She sat down. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. The jury was no longer looking at a defendant. They were looking at a champion. Silas Croft stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. He had been beaten not by a lawyer's trick, but by the undeniable moral force of the woman he had tried so desperately to break. Will looked at his wife. He saw her not as the frightened widow he had rescued, but as the magnificent, unbreakable woman she truly was. And a feeling he had thought long dead, a fierce and profound pride surged through him so powerful it felt like the breaking of a dam. The verdict was not yet read, but in his heart the case was already won. Of course. Here is the 7th chapter of the story. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. A profound, reverberating silence followed Emma's speech. The air in the courtroom, once thick with tension and hostility, was now charged with the electric, undeniable weight of truth. The jury, a panel of weathered, pragmatic men, no longer looked at Emma with suspicion or pity. They looked at her with a raw, unvarnished respect. The judge, a man who had seen decades of lies and legal maneuvering, peered down from his high bench, his customary sternness replaced by a look of deep contemplation. He looked at Emma. Then his gaze shifted to Silas Croft, and his expression hardened into one of undisguised contempt. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the monotone of a bored official, but the clear, ringing tone of a man delivering a long overdue judgment. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a stout man with the calloused hands of a blacksmith, stood without hesitation. He did not consult his fellow jurors. There was no need. "We have, Your Honor. And what is your verdict?" The foreman looked directly at Emma, then turned his gaze to Silas Croft like a man sighting down the barrel of a rifle. "On all charges," he declared, his voice booming in the silent room, "we find the defendant, Mrs. Emma Rose Blackwood, not guilty." A wave of cheers and applause erupted from the spectators, a dam of pent-up emotion breaking at last. The judge let the celebration continue for a moment before his gavel fell with the crack of a thunderclap demanding silence. "Order," he commanded. His eyes were fixed on Croft, who had gone deathly pale, his immaculate composure finally shattering. "This court is not finished." He leaned forward, his voice low and laced with cold fury. "Mr. Croft, for years you have used the laws of this territory not as a shield for the innocent, but as a club with which to bully and intimidate them. You have treated this courtroom a place of justice as your personal theater for your greed and malice. You have perjured yourself. You have conspired to defraud, and you have committed violence against a decent woman in an attempt to steal her home. Your actions are a perversion of justice and a cancer on the community of good, hard-working people in this territory." He pointed a long, bony finger at the stunned landowner. "This court finds you in contempt, but that is the very least of your concerns." He turned his flinty gaze to the sheriff. "Sheriff Miller, take this man into custody." The sheriff, who had once been Croft's pawn, now moved with an alacrity born of shame and a newfound sense of duty. He walked over to a sputtering, disbelieving Silas Croft. "Silas Croft." The sheriff said, his voice firm, "You are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud, perjury, and arson." As the iron handcuffs clicked shut around Croft's wrists, his empire of fear dissolved into whispers and stares. The man, who had held the valley in his financial grip, was now nothing more than a common criminal. His face a mask of impotent rage as he was led from the courtroom he had expected to command. Justice, it turned out, sometimes moved slowly, but its arrival was absolute. As Will and Emma prepared to leave, they found their path cleared. The crowd parted for them, their faces no longer holding the cautious distance of strangers, but the warmth and admiration of neighbors. Men who had never given Emma a second glance now tipped their hats. "Well done, Mrs. Blackwood," one said. Another rancher clapped Will on the shoulder. "You showed him, Will. You showed us all." Their lawyer, Samuel Thompson, met them at the door, a look of deep satisfaction on his face. "You didn't just win a case today," he said, shaking Will's hand, then nodding respectfully to Emma. "You reminded this town what courage looks like." He handed Will a folder of documents. "It's all here. The dismissal of charges, the official court record." He tapped one particular paper, the marriage certificate now bearing the official stamp of the territorial court. "And this is as solid as the mountains now." The judge made a point of entering a special validation into the record. "No one can ever question the legitimacy of this union. The shield, once a desperate strategy, had been forged into a permanent reality by the very fire that was meant to destroy them." Will tucked the folder under his arm, and then, in a gesture that felt both new and entirely natural, he gently took Emma's arm, tucking it into the crook of his own. They walked out of the courthouse and into the clean, bright sunlight of the afternoon. The stifling air of the courtroom was replaced by a fresh breeze that felt like the first breath of a new life. They were tired, emotionally exhausted, but they were victorious. They had walked into the lion's den and emerged not only unscathed, but stronger. As they stood on the courthouse steps blinking in the light, their eyes met. No words were needed. A silent understanding passed between them, an acknowledgment of the battle they had won and the profound, irrevocable change it had wrought upon them both. They had entered this fight as allies of convenience. They were leaving it as husband and wife, bound not just by law, but by the shared crucible of their victory. The future was an unknown territory, but for the first time they would face it together. The ride home from Cheyenne was a world away from the journey that had brought them there. The tense, awkward silence of their first trip as a legally bound yet emotionally distant couple had been replaced by a quiet that was deep, peaceful, and resonant. They rode closer now, their stirrups occasionally brushing a small, intimate contact that spoke volumes. The landscape itself seemed to have changed with them. The sun, beginning its slow descent, no longer seemed harsh or indifferent. It cast a golden, benevolent light across the plains, warming the silver-green sage and setting the distant peaks of the Tetons ablaze with alpenglow. The mountains were no longer ancient, sleeping sentinels, but majestic witnesses to their return. The Wyoming wind, once a relentless adversary, was now a soft whisper, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain, a promise of life and renewal. As they reached the familiar rise that overlooked both their properties, they reined in their horses by unspoken agreement. They looked out upon the land Will's powerful sprawling ranch and Emma's small tenacious homestead. Before, the two places had represented a gulf between wealth and poverty, strength and vulnerability. Now, bathed in the warm light of dusk, they looked like two parts of a single coherent whole. We'll run a new fence line from that creek right across to the west pasture. Will said, his voice thoughtful. It was the first time he had spoken in an hour. Combine the herds. It'll be more efficient. Emma smiled a genuine, easy smile that reached her eyes. And the new barn, she added, her gaze fixed on a flat, promising piece of ground near her house. We should build it there where it can catch the morning sun. A big one, with room for a milk cow and space for a real garden next to it, one the cattle can't trample. He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught the gold in her hair, and a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. A garden, he repeated, tasting the word. And trees. We should plant trees for shade, for the future. He was thinking not just in terms of seasons, but of generations. He was thinking of a home. A comfortable silence fell between them again as they contemplated the future they were sketching out in the air. It was a future of merged lands, of shared work, of planting and building. It was the natural, easy talk of a husband and wife planning their life together. The strangeness of that fact suddenly struck Will with overwhelming force. Emma, he said, his voice suddenly serious. He turned in his saddle to face her fully. When I asked you to marry me, I told you it was a covenant, a strategy, a matter of business. She met his gaze, her own expression soft and questioning. I was wrong, he said, his voice a low, gravelly admission. Or maybe I was just lying to myself. It stopped being a business arrangement the moment I saw you stand up in that courtroom. It stopped being about land or law, and it became about you, about the pride I felt, about not wanting to imagine a future that you weren't in. Tears welled in Emma's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were a reflection of the golden light all around them. I was so afraid that day, Will, she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. But my deepest fear was not of losing the ranch or even of going to jail. It was of losing this fragile thing that was growing between us. I think my heart knew you were my home long before my head was willing to admit it. He swung down from his horse in one fluid motion and walked to her side, looking up at her. He held up his arms, and she slid from her saddle and into them without hesitation. He held her close, his face buried in her hair, breathing in her scent as if he had been starved of air. He drew back slightly, his calloused hands cupping her face with a reverence she had never imagined possible. He looked into her eyes, and she saw it all there, the lonely rancher, the grieving widower, the fierce protector, the man who had fallen in love with her against all his better judgment. The last wall around his heart crumbled into dust. Emma Blackwood, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. And then he kissed her. It was not the hesitant, uncertain kiss of two strangers. It was a kiss of confirmation of homecoming. It was the culmination of every shared silence, every mended fence, every battle won. It was a promise made not in a dusty courtroom, but under the vast, open Wyoming sky. It was the sealing of a covenant made not of convenience, but of a deep and abiding love. When they finally drew apart, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. They stood together, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, and looked out at their land. Their land. 2 ranches, 2 lives, 2 lonely hearts now and forever one. They were not just survivors of the harsh frontier. They were founders. And here, in the heart of Wyoming, they would build their legacy a testament not to wealth or power, but to the enduring, resilient power of love. If this story moved your heart, if it reminded you that even in the harshest deserts, love can bloom like a wildflower, then you've found the right trail. Subscribe to the Wild West Way for more tales of rugged survival, quiet bravery, and the unwritten laws of the heart that define the frontier. From dusty trails to whispered promises, every story is crafted to stay with you long after the last word. This is where legends are born and courage is king. This is the Wild West Way. Subscribe now and never miss a step of the journey.